The restaurant was quiet, the kind of quiet that cost money. The lighting was dim, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged wine, and truffle oil. The kind of place where no one raised their voice above a hushed murmur, where secrets were exchanged over crystal glasses, and where deals were struck with nothing more than a glance. Serena Mayfield sat at a corner table, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows across her face. She wasn't nervous, she didn't allow herself to be, but there was something unsettling about this meeting. She had been to places like this before, had dined with men who thought they could buy anything, but this time was different. She could feel it. The man sitting across from her was not like the others. Lawrence Lark Devereaux. His name alone sent whispers through Wall Street, a man with more power than some governments, a billionaire who rarely appeared in public, a ghost who moved entire industries with a single decision. Some called him ruthless, others called him brilliant. No one called him predictable. Serena had seen pictures of him before, grainy paparazzi shots, business magazine covers, the occasional glimpse of him at exclusive charity galas, but none of them captured the intensity of his presence. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. His hair was neatly styled, a deep brown with a hint of silver at the temples, and his features were sharp, carved from something colder than stone. His eyes, however, were the most striking, piercing, calculating, as if he could see straight through her. And maybe he could. She took a sip of her wine, her fingers steady on the glass. "You didn't tell me what this meeting was about," she said, breaking the silence between them. Lark tilted his head slightly, a slow, deliberate movement. "You came anyway. You made it impossible to refuse." His lips twitched, just barely. "That's what I do." She didn't react. She had been around powerful men before, men who thrived on control, men who mistook dominance for intelligence. But something about Lark Devereaux made her wary in a way she couldn't quite place. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "I'll get to the point, Ms. Mayfield." She already knew whatever he was about to say would change everything. "I want to buy your time." The words lingered between them, heavy and precise. She arched an eyebrow. "My time?" "One night." Silence. She had expected many things. A business proposition, an offer of employment, maybe even an investment opportunity disguised as something more personal. But this? It was almost laughable. She let out a soft breath, tilting her head as she studied him. "I think you have me confused with someone else, Mr. Devereaux." "I don't," he said simply. His confidence was unnerving. He wasn't uncertain, wasn't testing the waters. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he expected her to comply. Serena set her glass down carefully. "I'm not for sale." Lark didn't blink. "I'm not asking for sex." That caught her off guard. His expression remained unreadable, his voice steady, detached, as if they were discussing a contract negotiation instead of an outrageous proposal. She narrowed her eyes. "Then what are you asking for?" "I want you to stay with me for one night. No questions. No interruptions. Just you and me." Serena felt a slow chill creep down her spine. She had heard of men paying for exclusivity, for discretion. But this was different. She wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. "And what exactly am I supposed to do?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. His gaze didn't waver. "Whatever you want. You don't have to talk to me. You don't even have to look at me. You just have to be there." The way he said it, the way his voice dropped just slightly, sent a shiver down her skin. This wasn't about companionship. This wasn't about control. It was something else entirely. She exhaled slowly, placing her hands flat on the table, steadying herself. "And for this, you're offering what, exactly?" $1 million. The words hit like a physical force. $1 million. For one night. Not sex. Not intimacy. Just her presence. It was absurd. It was suspicious. And yet, Serena felt something shift inside her. She wasn't a fool. No one threw around that kind of money without a reason. Whatever Lark Devereaux wanted, it was bigger than what he was telling her. But $1 million was life-changing. It was security. It was freedom. It was a way out. She tapped her fingers against the table, considering the weight of his offer. And after that? His expression remained unreadable. After that, we go our separate ways. It sounded like a lie. It felt like a trap. But Serena wasn't the type to run from danger. She leaned back in her chair, meeting his gaze head-on. Fine. For the first time that night, Lark Devereaux smiled. And Serena had the sinking feeling that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Serena arrived at the address Lark had given her just after 9 p.m. The townhouse was unlike anything she had expected, no towering penthouse, no modern glass fortress overlooking the city. Instead, it was an old, ivy-covered brownstone in the heart of Manhattan, a relic from another era. The moment she stepped out of the car, the night felt different. The air was thick with the scent of rain on pavement, and the soft glow of the street lamps cast long shadows across the cobblestone walkway leading to the front door. This wasn't the kind of place where billionaires lived. It was the kind of place where they hid. She hesitated for only a moment before pressing the brass doorbell. A low chime echoed somewhere inside, deep and resonant, like something from a cathedral. The door opened almost immediately. Lark stood in the dim entryway, his silhouette framed by the warm, golden light spilling from inside. He had discarded the suit from earlier, now dressed in a black cashmere sweater and dark trousers, his sleeves pushed up just enough to reveal strong forearms. For some reason, that detail unnerved her more than anything else. "You're early," he observed, his voice as calm and measured as ever. She glanced at her watch. "I was curious." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, but he said nothing. He simply stepped aside, allowing her in. The inside of the townhouse was as surprising as the exterior. It wasn't cold or sterile like she had expected. Instead, it was filled with dark wood, shelves lined with books, soft leather furniture, and dim lighting that gave the place an almost intimate glow. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, filling the room with warmth. It felt lived in. She wasn't sure why that surprised her. "You live here?" she asked, slipping off her coat. "No," he took it from her, hanging it on a sleek wooden rack near the door. "Then why here?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the sitting area near the fireplace. "Drink?" She hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Whiskey." "Neat." He smirked, as if that answer had amused him, then disappeared into what she assumed was a bar hidden somewhere in the room. Serena wandered toward the bookshelves, her fingers trailing along the spines of old, leather-bound volumes. The books weren't for show, some had cracked bindings, others had dog-eared pages. There was something personal about them, something intimate. It made her uneasy. She turned just as he returned, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. He handed her one and raised his own in a silent toast. She mirrored him, the glass cool against her fingers as she took a slow sip. The whiskey was expensive, smooth, but it burned just enough to remind her where she was. "I have to admit," she said, lowering her glass, "I don't understand what this is." Lark watched her for a long moment before responding. "I didn't expect you to." He sat down in one of the leather armchairs by the fire, crossing one leg over the other. He didn't motion for her to sit, didn't tell her what to do. It was a small detail, but it unsettled her. He wasn't treating this like a transaction. He wasn't acting like a man who had just paid a woman $1 million to spend a night in his company. He was watching her. Studying her. Serena took another sip of whiskey before finally lowering herself into the chair opposite him. The firelight cast sharp shadows along his jawline, highlighting the slight tension there. For the first time since meeting him, she realized something. Lark Devereaux wasn't just rich. He was haunted. She exhaled slowly, setting her glass on the table between them. You said you don't want sex. You don't want conversation. You just want me here. Why? For a long time, he didn't answer. Then, finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse spike. Have you ever spent a night with a stranger, he murmured, and known, without a doubt, that by morning, everything would be different? His words sent a slow shiver down her spine. She swallowed. No. He exhaled through his nose, almost like he expected that answer. Neither have I. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. Serena could feel something shift, something unseen pressing between them like an invisible force. She didn't know what Lark Devereaux wanted from her. But she had the sinking feeling that, whatever it was, she was already in too deep. The night stretched long and silent between them. Serena sat back in her chair, her fingers absently running along the rim of her whiskey glass. The fire crackled softly, filling the space with its warm glow, but it did little to dispel the strange energy lingering between them. Lark had fallen quiet, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, lost in some place she couldn't follow. He looked like a man carrying ghosts, the kind that whispered in the dark and never let go. Serena wasn't sure why she stayed. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the unspoken weight of the $1 million now sitting in her bank account, a constant, invisible reminder that she had agreed to this. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because Lark Devereaux didn't look at her like a man who had bought her. He looked at her like a man who was waiting for something. She just didn't know what. She took a slow sip of her drink, letting the heat of the whiskey settle in her chest. You're quiet, she observed. He didn't look at her. So are you. Should I be talking? Only if you want to. His voice was low, steady, like the rumble of an approaching storm. Serena studied him carefully, searching for cracks in his carefully constructed exterior. She had spent her entire life reading people, understanding their motives before they had the chance to use them against her. But Lark was unreadable. She set her drink down on the table between them. You brought me here, she said. Paid an obscene amount of money for one night of my time. But you don't want anything from me. He finally turned his head, meeting her gaze. Who said I don't want anything? Her breath caught, but she forced herself to hold his stare. Then what do you want? Lark studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. A moment in time, he murmured. His words sent a chill down her spine. Serena frowned. That's vague, even for you. His lips twitched in something that might have been amusement. Let me ask you something, Serena. If you could take one night, just one, and exist in it, outside of everything else, outside of expectations, outside of consequences, would you take it? She hesitated. Is that what this is? An escape? Maybe. His voice dropped slightly, his eyes still locked onto hers. Or maybe it's something else. The way he said it sent a slow pulse of heat through her veins. Serena wasn't naive. She had spent too many years navigating the world of powerful men to mistake this for some philosophical exercise. Lark wasn't here for meaningless conversation, and he sure as hell hadn't paid her just to sit in silence. But at the same time, she didn't feel like he was testing her. It felt like he was waiting. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. You don't seem like a man who needs an escape. His expression darkened just slightly. Everyone needs an escape from something. Serena wasn't sure what unnerved her more, that he was right, or that she had the sudden, undeniable urge to know exactly what he was running from. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Lark stood, moving toward the bar. The way he carried himself was effortless, controlled, but Serena noticed something she hadn't before, the faintest tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed just slightly before he reached for the decanter. He poured himself another drink, then turned back to her. "Tell me something, Serena. What's your price?" She raised an eyebrow. "You already paid it." "That was for one night." He took a slow sip of his whiskey, watching her over the rim of his glass. "I'm asking about your real price. The number that makes you walk away from all of this and never look back." Something about the way he said it made her uneasy. She exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. "That's a dangerous question." "Why?" "Because if you know someone's price, you know exactly how to break them." For the first time that night, something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. "Smart answer," he murmured. Serena held his gaze. "You still haven't answered my question, though. Why am I here?" He set his glass down on the bar, his fingers lingering against the crystal. "Because I needed you to be." That was not the answer she had expected. Her pulse kicked up slightly, though she kept her face neutral. "You don't even know me." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I know what it feels like to see someone and realize they don't belong to anyone. Not really. Not even to themselves." A cold weight settled in her chest. She swallowed. "You think that's me?" "I know it is." His voice was quiet, certain, and something inside her twisted at the truth of it. Serena had spent years convincing herself that she was in control, that she belonged to no one, that she made her own choices. But deep down, she knew Lark was right. She had never truly belonged anywhere. And for the first time in a long time, that terrified her. She stood abruptly, crossing the room to where he stood. The distance between them was small now, too small. "You're playing a dangerous game, Lark," she murmured. A ghost of a smirk crossed his lips. "So are you." Serena didn't move. Neither did he. The air between them was thick, electric, but not in the way she had expected. This wasn't about seduction. This was about something deeper. Something unspoken. Something dangerous. The realization sent a sharp pulse of adrenaline through her veins. She had come here thinking this was just another transaction. But now she knew the truth. Lark Devereaux hadn't bought her for a night. He had brought her into something she didn't understand. And she wasn't sure she would make it out the same. The clock on the mantel read 1:17 a.m. Serena hadn't expected to stay this long. When she agreed to Lark's bizarre proposition, she imagined a long night of strained silence, perhaps a glass of wine, and then slipping away before dawn, $1 million heavier but unchanged. She had been wrong. She was still here, and nothing about this felt like a simple transaction anymore. The fire had burned lower, the once roaring flames reduced to glowing embers. The whiskey had settled into her system, making her warm but not clouded. She was too aware, too attuned to the man across the room from her. Lark Devereaux. He hadn't touched her, hadn't so much as stood too close, yet the space between them felt charged. It wasn't sexual, at least, not entirely. It was something deeper, something unspoken. A pull. He sat across from her, one arm draped lazily over the armrest of his chair, his gaze unreadable. He looked completely at ease, but Serena knew better. There was a tension beneath the surface, a quiet storm brewing in the way his fingers tapped absently against the rim of his glass. "Tell me something," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Serena arched a brow. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you're going to ask me another question that feels like a trap." The ghost of a smirk played at the corner of his lips. "No traps. Just curiosity." She tilted her head slightly, watching him. Go ahead, then. Lark swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze fixed on hers. When was the last time someone looked at you and really saw you? The question was like a slow unraveling inside her chest. Serena didn't let it show. She leaned back, exhaling through her nose as she considered his words. People see what they want to see, she said finally. They see what's convenient. But that's not what I asked. Of course it wasn't. Serena tapped her nails against the arm of her chair, her mind sifting through memories she usually ignored. The truth was, she wasn't sure if anyone had ever really seen her. Not in the way Lark meant. Men had admired her. They had wanted her, chased her, tried to own pieces of her. But to be seen. That was something else entirely. She forced a small, sardonic smile. I'm guessing you think you see me, then. Lark's expression didn't change. I know I do. The certainty in his voice sent a strange sensation through her, something dangerously close to unease. She stood, suddenly restless, and walked toward the fireplace. Her fingers grazed the smooth wooden mantel as she stared into the dying embers. You like doing that, don't you? She murmured. Doing what? Making people uncomfortable. Making them confront things they don't want to. Lark set his glass down with a soft clink. I think you and I both know that I'm not the one making you uncomfortable right now. She closed her eyes briefly. Damn him. Serena turned, leaning against the mantel as she folded her arms. You still haven't told me why I'm really here, Lark. His gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. And yet, you're still here. He wasn't wrong. But that only made her more frustrated. Serena wasn't the type to linger in situations she couldn't control. She had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, of knowing when to walk away before she got too close, before anything could reach inside her and take hold. And yet, here she was. You're deflecting, she said, narrowing her eyes slightly. So are you. They stared at each other for a long moment, the firelight casting long shadows across the room. Then Lark stood. He moved slowly, deliberately, closing the space between them until he was just a breath away. He didn't touch her. Didn't trap her. But he was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that his scent, something dark and clean, like cedar wood and smoke, settled in the air between them. Serena's pulse spiked, but she didn't move. Tell me why I'm here, she said again, her voice quieter this time. Lark's gaze flickered over her face, lingering just long enough to make her feel bare, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physicality. Then he exhaled, his voice dropping to something lower, something rougher. Because I wanted to remember what it feels like to be near someone who doesn't owe me anything. Serena blinked. She had expected a lot of things. That was not one of them. Something inside her chest tightened, unfamiliar and unwelcome. She swallowed, suddenly unsure of what to say. Lark let the silence settle between them, his gaze searching hers for something she wasn't sure she could give him. Then, as if deciding something, he stepped back, creating space again. The air shifted. Just like that, the moment was gone. Serena took a slow breath, steadying herself. You're a strange man, Lark Devereaux. He smirked, but there was something tired in it. You're not the first to say that. She should leave. She knew that. Whatever was happening between them wasn't something she had agreed to. It wasn't something she had prepared for. But still, her feet remained planted. Her heart beat a little too fast. And somewhere deep in her gut, she had the terrible, sinking feeling that this night was going to change everything. The clock now read 2:04 a.m. Serena sat on the velvet couch near the fireplace, her legs crossed, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her whiskey glass. The ice had long since melted, watering down the liquor, but she hadn't touched it in nearly an hour. Lark had disappeared into another room moments ago, leaving her alone in the flickering firelight. She should have taken his absence as an excuse to leave. Instead, she stayed. That was the part that unsettled her the most. She had spent years perfecting the art of walking away, always one step ahead, always in control of what came next. Yet tonight, with Lark Devereaux, she wasn't sure where she was going. And worse, she wasn't sure if she wanted to go anywhere at all. The quiet click of a door opening made her look up. Lark reappeared, now carrying a small wooden box, the kind that looked like it belonged in a dusty attic or an antique shop. He set it down on the low coffee table between them before sinking back into the chair across from her. Serena arched a brow. Should I be worried? His lips twitched, but the amusement didn't quite reach his eyes. Only if you don't like surprises. She exhaled, watching him as he flipped the latch and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, nestled against the deep blue velvet lining, was a deck of playing cards. Serena frowned. Cards. Lark slid the deck out, shuffling it between his fingers with a practiced ease. Do you play? She tilted her head slightly, studying him. You don't strike me as the kind of man who wastes time on games. I don't. He glanced up at her, his fingers still moving effortlessly over the cards. But this isn't about the game. Serena leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite herself. Then what is it about? He set the shuffled deck down between them. A trade. Her pulse kicked up slightly. What kind of trade? Lark's gaze held hers. You draw a card. I answer a question, truthfully. Then I draw a card, and you do the same. Serena hesitated. It sounded simple enough, but nothing with Lark Devereaux was ever simple. Still, curiosity prickled at her, outweighing whatever caution told her to refuse. Fine. She reached forward, her fingers brushing against the smooth edges of the deck. And no lying. No lying. She lifted a single card from the pile and flipped it over. The Queen of Hearts. Lark smirked slightly, as if he found something amusing about the choice, but he said nothing. Serena considered her question carefully. What's the worst thing you've ever done? She asked. The air shifted slightly. Lark didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening just slightly, as if weighing how much to reveal. Then, finally, he exhaled. I left someone behind, he said, his voice quieter now. And I shouldn't have. A chill ran down Serena's spine at the weight in his words. She waited, but he didn't elaborate. Who? She asked. Lark met her gaze, and for the first time that night, something in his expression cracked, just for a second. Just long enough for her to see the shadow behind his carefully controlled exterior. Someone I should have protected, he said. Serena's fingers tightened around the glass in her hand. There was something about the way he said it, the raw honesty in his voice, that made her stomach twist. Who had he left? And more importantly, why did it still haunt him? Before she could press further, Lark reached for the deck. His turn. He slid a card from the pile and flipped it over. The Ace of Spades. Serena exhaled sharply, unable to hide her smirk. Fitting. Lark's lips curved slightly. I'm almost afraid to ask. She leaned forward slightly. What's your greatest fear? His smirk faded. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he set the card down on the table, tapping a single finger against its surface. Oblivion, he murmured. Serena's breath caught. She hadn't expected that answer. He didn't fear death. He feared disappearing. Being forgotten. Being erased. She didn't know why that unsettled her so much. Lark's fingers brushed against the deck again, but before he could draw another card, Serena reached forward and placed her hand over his. His gaze snapped up to meet hers, something flickering behind his eyes. We don't need the cards, she said softly. Lark didn't move. Neither did she. They stayed like that, suspended in something thick and unspoken, something heavier than either of them had anticipated. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Lark withdrew his hand. Serena pulled hers back, curling her fingers into her palm, as if she could erase the feeling of his warmth against her skin. The fire had burned low now, casting soft shadows along the walls. Serena knew she should leave. The night was nearly over. But something inside her told her that if she walked out that door, something between them would break. So instead, she exhaled slowly and said, "Tell me about them." Lark didn't ask who she meant. He looked down at the card still resting on the table, the ace of spades, and then back at her. And finally, he spoke. "They were the only person who ever believed I was worth saving," he murmured. "And I let them down." Serena felt something tighten in her chest. She had come here for a transaction. But now, it felt like something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something real. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dim, flickering glow. Serena's whiskey was untouched now, forgotten on the table between them. The deck of cards remained where they had left it, a quiet symbol of whatever unspoken game they had been playing. But this wasn't a game anymore. Lark's words lingered in the air between them, heavier than anything else in the room. "They were the only person who ever believed I was worth saving. And I let them down." Serena had spent years learning how to pick apart a lie, how to recognize when someone was giving her half-truths or carefully crafted manipulations. But Lark wasn't lying. He wasn't even trying to hide it. For the first time since she had walked through that door, she felt the edges of something raw beneath his carefully controlled exterior. And she wasn't sure she was ready to see what lay underneath. She leaned back against the couch, stretching her legs slightly as she folded her arms. "You don't strike me as the kind of man who has regrets, Lark." His gaze flicked up to meet hers. "Then you don't know me at all." "Maybe not." She tilted her head. "But I'd like to." A small, humorless smile curved his lips. "That's a dangerous thing to want." Serena held his stare. "I think we passed dangerous a long time ago." Lark exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing along the edge of his glass. He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding something. Then, finally, he spoke. His name was Nathaniel. Serena didn't move, barely even breathed. Lark had never spoken about this person before, whoever they were. And yet, the way his voice dropped when he said the name, the weight behind it, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just someone from his past. This was a ghost he had been carrying for a long, long time. "He was my best friend," Lark said, his voice quiet. "My brother, in every way that mattered. He pulled me out of places I never should have been in. He kept me from becoming someone I didn't want to be." Serena swallowed. She had never heard Lark speak like this before. There was no calculation in his voice, no careful distance. Just grief. "What happened?" she asked, softer now. Lark's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, crossing the room to the bar, but he didn't pour another drink. He just stood there, staring down at the polished surface, his fingers gripping the edge like he was grounding himself. Serena waited. She had the feeling this wasn't something he talked about. Maybe not ever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled. "I got him killed." The words hit the air like a gunshot. Serena's pulse kicked up slightly. "Not I lost him. Not he's gone. I got him killed." She sat up straighter, her hands pressing against her knees. "Lark." He turned then, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were something else entirely. "They came for me," he said, his voice low, steady. But he got in the way. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't about business deals gone wrong or Wall Street betrayals. This was something deeper. Darker. She didn't know what Lark Devereaux had been involved in before he became the man the world knew, but whatever it was, it had cost him more than money. Serena's fingers curled slightly against her palms. Who came for you? Lark hesitated for only a second. People you don't want to know. It wasn't an answer. Not really. But Serena had spent enough time around dangerous men to recognize when someone was speaking from experience. And Lark Devereaux was speaking from experience. She exhaled slowly. That's why you brought me here, isn't it? Lark didn't move. Didn't deny it. Serena felt her heart beat a little harder in her chest. You're running from something, she murmured. Or someone. A flicker of something crossed his face, so quick she almost missed it. Then, finally, he said, I don't run. It should have sounded arrogant. It should have been a lie. But it wasn't. Serena didn't know what Lark had done, or what he had been caught up in, but she knew one thing, he wasn't afraid. And that terrified her more than anything else. Because men who weren't afraid, they were the ones who had already lost too much to care what happened next. The air between them felt heavy now, charged with something she couldn't name. She should leave. She should take the money and walk away before she got pulled into something she couldn't escape. But instead, she stayed. Because for the first time since she had met Lark Devereaux, she wasn't thinking about the $1 million. She was thinking about him. And she wasn't sure if that was more dangerous than anything else in this room. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, settling into the corners of the dimly lit room. The fire had burned down to nothing but glowing embers, casting long shadows across Lark's face. His confession lingered in the air, weighty and immovable. I got him killed. Serena couldn't shake the way he had said it, flat, almost detached, like he had long since made peace with it. Or maybe, like a man who no longer expected forgiveness. But she had seen something in his eyes. Something broken. She should have left then. Should have thanked him for the $1 million, picked up her coat, and walked out of this townhouse, out of his world, out of whatever this was before it swallowed her whole. But she didn't move. Instead, she exhaled slowly, leaning forward, her elbows resting on her knees. Tell me. Lark's gaze flicked up to hers. He didn't ask tell you what. He didn't pretend not to understand. He just watched her for a long moment, like he was trying to decide if it was worth it, if she was worth it. Then, finally, he spoke. 5 years ago, I made a mistake. His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous beneath the surface, something sharp-edged. I trusted the wrong people. Serena stayed silent, waiting. Lark's fingers curled around the edge of his whiskey glass, but he didn't drink. Nathaniel and I started together. We built everything from the ground up. He was better than me, smarter, kinder, not as ruthless. But he believed in me, even when he shouldn't have. Something in his jaw tightened, and Serena had the strange, painful realization that this wasn't just a friend he had lost. This was family, the kind you chose, not the kind you were born into. Lark exhaled slowly, his voice dropping lower. We made a deal with the wrong people. I thought I could control it. I thought, he broke off, shaking his head slightly, as if disgusted with himself. But you can't control men like that. You don't negotiate with them. You either serve them, or you become a liability. A chill crawled down Serena's spine. She knew that kind of power. The kind that didn't exist on paper, the kind that never made it to the headlines but dictated the world behind the scenes. And you became a liability, she guessed. Lark's lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. Nathaniel did. Serena felt her stomach drop. Lark ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. They didn't kill him right away. They wanted to send a message first. They wanted me to watch. The breath caught in Serena's throat. She had seen many things in her life, had met powerful men who wielded destruction like a tool, but she had never met someone who had been forced to watch the death of the person they loved. Her fingers tightened against her knee. "And what did you do?" Lark's gaze flicked to her, something cold flashing behind his eyes. "What do you think?" She held his stare. "I think you're still here." A muscle in his jaw twitched. There was an entire story in that single movement. He hadn't just walked away. He had done something. Serena swallowed. "Did you kill them?" Lark leaned back in his chair, watching her with something almost unreadable. "Not all of them." It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no, either. Serena let out a slow breath. "And now they're after you." Lark was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, "They will be." Serena felt something inside her twist. She had thought she understood what this was: one night, one transaction, one escape. But now, sitting here in the dim firelight, she realized she had been wrong. This wasn't about $1 million. This was about something far more dangerous. Lark had brought her here for a reason. And she wasn't sure she wanted to know what it was. She stood abruptly, needing distance, needing air. But Lark didn't stop her. He just watched as she walked across the room, as she pressed her palms against the cold marble of the fireplace mantel, as she tried to ignore the way her hands were shaking. She had spent years surviving. Years making sure no one got too close, making sure she was always in control. But Lark Devereaux was unraveling her. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if she wanted him to stop. She turned slowly, crossing her arms over her chest. "So what now?" Lark's gaze didn't waver. "That depends on you." Serena narrowed her eyes. "On me? You can leave." He gestured toward the door. "Take the money. Walk away. Forget this ever happened." The room felt too quiet. "And if I don't?" she asked. Lark's lips twitched, but it wasn't amusement. It was something else. Something darker. "If you don't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "then you should be ready for what happens next." A shiver ran down her spine. She should leave. She knew that. But instead, she walked toward him, closing the distance between them until she was close enough to feel the heat of his body, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. "Tell me the truth, Lark," she murmured. His gaze flickered over her face. "About what?" "About why I'm really here." Something shifted in his expression. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled. "Because they're watching me." Her breath caught. Lark's voice was quiet, but there was something deadly beneath the surface. "And if they think you're important to me," he continued, "they'll start watching you, too." A cold wave of realization washed over her. This wasn't a transaction. This wasn't an escape. This was a warning. And it was already too late to run. A sharp, cold silence settled between them. Serena felt the weight of Lark's words press against her chest, heavy and unrelenting. "They're watching me. And if they think you're important to me, they'll start watching you, too." She should have been afraid. She should have walked away the moment she realized this wasn't just about $1 million night, that it wasn't about a man with too much money and too many ghosts. But instead, she was standing in the middle of his home, firelight casting flickering shadows along the walls, staring into the eyes of a man who had just pulled her into something she didn't fully understand. And she wasn't running. Serena exhaled slowly, crossing her arms over her chest. "That was a hell of a time to tell me, Lark." Lark didn't smile. He just watched her, silent, unreadable. She could feel the tension radiating off him now, not the same quiet control he had carried all night, but something else. Something volatile, something restless, like he was already calculating the next move, already preparing for the inevitable. "You knew this would happen," she said. Lark exhaled through his nose, turning slightly, resting his hands against the edge of the fireplace mantel. "I suspected." Serena narrowed her eyes. "And you still brought me here?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, finally, he said, "I didn't think I'd care." His voice was quiet. Almost too quiet. Serena's pulse kicked up slightly. She didn't know why those words affected her so much. She should have been insulted. Should have been furious that he had made her collateral in a game she didn't even know she was playing. But instead, she felt something else. Something dangerously close to understanding. "Well," she said, keeping her voice steady, "that's unfortunate, isn't it?" Lark turned then, his gaze locking onto hers. "For you." "For both of us," she murmured. A flicker of something passed across his face, something that looked almost like regret. But it was gone before she could name it. She swallowed. "How bad is this, Lark?" His fingers curled slightly against the mantel, the only sign of tension in his otherwise controlled frame. "Bad enough that if you leave here tonight, you should go straight to the airport. Pick a country. Disappear." Serena's stomach twisted. She didn't ask if he was serious. She already knew he was. "You think they'd come after me?" Lark's jaw tightened. "They wouldn't kill you. Not right away." The room felt colder, even with the fire still burning. Serena forced herself to hold his gaze. "And if I stay?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Then you're choosing a different kind of danger." The air between them shifted, thick with something unspoken. She should have been rational. She should have thought about self-preservation, about taking the money, about disappearing into the world and never looking back. But there was something about Lark Devereaux that made her forget logic. Something about the way he carried his grief like a weapon, the way he looked at her like he was seeing someone he hadn't expected to find. Something about the fact that, despite everything, she trusted him. And she had never trusted anyone. Serena took a slow step forward. "If you wanted to get rid of me, Lark, you would have let me walk out that door hours ago." Lark didn't move. "You don't understand what you're saying." She tilted her head slightly. "Then explain it to me." He let out a slow breath, his gaze dark and unreadable. "They took everything from me once, Serena. And if they think you're a weakness, if they think you mean something." He cut himself off, his fingers pressing harder against the mantel. Serena stepped closer. "Then let them think it." Lark's breath hitched just slightly. For the first time since she had met him, something in his expression cracked. Not much. Just enough. Just enough for her to see the truth beneath it all. He had never intended to care. But now it was too late. Serena reached up slowly, hesitating for only a second before placing her hand against his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her fingertips, tense, like he was fighting himself, like he was fighting the need to pull away. Or maybe the need to lean in. "You don't get to make this decision for me," she murmured. Lark's jaw clenched beneath her touch. "You should hate me for bringing you into this." She let out a quiet breath. "Maybe I should." He was so still, so quiet, but there was a storm in his eyes, something raw and unresolved, something that told her this had never happened before. That no one had ever stayed. And maybe that was why she couldn't leave. Lark exhaled slowly. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." Serena's lips curved slightly. "I didn't ask for easy, Devereaux." Something shifted then. Not just between them. But in him. Lark reached up, his fingers brushing over her wrist, holding it there just for a second, just long enough for her to feel the warmth of his skin, the steady pulse beneath. Then, finally, he said, then I hope you're ready for war. Serena's breath caught, but she didn't move. She had thought this night was just a transaction. But now she knew the truth. This was only the beginning.